Ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and get underway. We have decided to record a series of presentations around the America 250 commemoration, and we have invited you folks to come and join us for tonight's recording. You are the select few who we have invited to be with us tonight, so thank you so much for coming. My name is Doug Swaim. I am on the McDowell County America 250 committee, and I welcome you to the second in our speaker series. Our intention is to have these presentations more or less every month between now and the big event, which is July the 4th, 2026. So we invite you to come back for all of them. In North Carolina, the America 250 commemoration is being coordinated by the Department of Cultural and Natural Resources, and they have charged us with exploring two big themes. One is Revolutionary NC, the history around our Revolutionary period, and the other is a little more abstract. It is, the name of it, they've given it, is When Are We Us? And it's sort of a play on When Are We the United States? And it is an exploration of our effort through the years to live up to those founding principles that are enshrined in the documents from around our founding, such as the Declaration of Independence. And it's our intention in the speaker series to treat both of these big themes. So far, last month and tonight, we're back with our Revolutionary Era history. Tonight's speaker is Dr. John Lafferty, who is visiting us from over in Morganton. John has deep roots in the Piedmont. In 2022, he retired after practicing OB/GYN medicine in Morganton and Burke County for 40 years. Now, I'm not sure what the population of Burke County is these days, but I think he delivered like 6,500 of the current residents or thereabouts. Despite a busy career, John has nurtured a lifelong love of country and an interest in our nation's history and government. He serves on the board of the Historic Burke Foundation as a docent for the Exploring Joara Foundation and is an active member of the Sons of the American Revolution. John's background serves him well for tonight's talk on the Scots-Irish. He hopes to convey the importance of this group on our nation's founding and guiding principles today. With that, I give you Dr. John Lafferty.
I'll wear the hat for 3 more seconds for a photo op, but I'm going to take it off because and we'll put it right over here along with the water. And this style of talking, and can you hear me fine now? Are you good? Can you hear me? Yes. All right. Is I don't just stand up here and lecture and let you go to sleep. You're going to have to answer some questions, so be on guard. And so we're going to start right off saying I thank Doug Swaim for allowing me to come. I am very honored to be in this historic train depot, perhaps the oldest train depot in this entire end of the state, and you should be very proud to have restored it, as we are for some of the facilities we have down in Burke County. I also want to remind you, if you didn't already know, that the years we're talking about in early America, we are all the same people because we were all Burke County at that time, right? McDowell County was carved out of Burke County around 1840. So my first question is, do we have anybody who's Irish here? Anybody think they're Irish? Okay. How about Scot? Anybody think they're a Scot? How about British? Anybody was their head of the British? Okay. How about Scots-Irish? How many of you, and here's the honesty question, and I hope you raise your hand, aren't real sure you could define that term, Scots-Irish? If you raise your hand, then this lecture is for you. If you went to Britain and said, I'd like to talk about the Scotch-Irish, they might look at you like you're a little crazy until you say, well, what about the people in Northern Ireland that were over there? Oh, you mean the Ulster Scots, of course. So it's Ulster Scots to the British. And what we're going to do tonight, hopefully, is entertain you, and we are going to talk about how this ethnic group of people got caught up in the American Revolution and how they were shaped by the great sweep of history that occurred in the 2 centuries before this time, and how they in turn helped to shape this great country. And when I talk about history, I have learned something over these 3 years. I did practice medicine for 40 years, and we always emphasize medicine as an inexact science. This is nothing, there's lots of nuance to it, and it's a lot more definite than history, let me tell you. History is always subjective, and I am certain that there's somebody that's going to raise an objection to what I say or say it's not accurate, because it is very hard to get the facts completely straight about anything. Facts are often forgotten. Memories of what happened in battles or what happened to this famous person are a lot of times de-emphasized. If you doubt that, think about an auto accident on the street out here tonight, and 4 of us saw it. We might not report exactly the same thing. Facts are left out. Occasionally there is a deliberate commission or omission. We have found our northern historical friends tend to leave out much of what happened down here during the Revolutionary War, and we're working gently to correct that misconception. The honest historian, and I hope I'm an honest historian, amateur, try to get it right, and we know it's basically an approximation. If we want to talk about the sweep of history and why this area is so important to the founding of our country and the Revolutionary War, I think everybody knows that we are talking about the events of the South from 1780 on. To briefly summarize to a group that probably already knows, the American Revolutionary War was probably the fomenting of discontent started after what the British called the 7 Years' War and what we call the French and Indian War. They had expended a lot of money to expel the French from this area and to secure the land for the British, and the coffers of the king were quite low as a result of that. They said, you know, you're the ones that benefited, so we're going to tax you selectively. And that didn't sit well with the American colonists that increasingly saw themselves as being independent people. And they certainly felt that they were being treated as less than British citizens. You all know about the famous things, the Intolerable Acts, the Stamp Act, obviously the tax on tea, the Boston Tea Party. And I commend you to go to Boston. It is a fun experience to reenact with them every day the Boston Tea Party when you get to do that if you go on the tour. And so increasingly, and you know somewhat reluctantly, but eventually on July the 4th of 1776, the American colonists formally declared their independence, and war began. It had already begun to a certain degree. And it went on for about 4 years, mainly in the north. And despite the victory at Saratoga and bringing in the French into the war, which is something the British tried so hard to avoid, the Americans couldn't drive the British off the continent. Likewise, the British didn't seem to be able to subdue Washington and his troops. And so it was a stalemate. Like Vietnam today, people in Parliament, people on the street became increasingly discontented with the war. Why are we doing this? Why are we spending all this money? Why are our sons dying over there? And Lord North actually offered his resignation in Parliament, and King George pulled him into his throne room and said, I want a new strategy. And they got together with several other ministers, and the Southern strategy was conceived. It basically was what you probably already know. You know what? There are a lot of Tories or loyalists, people friendly to Britain down south. Why don't we go down there and capture with our forces the big cities in the south and start recruiting Tories as we move our armies north, and we will trap Washington from the north and from the south. So British General Clinton sailed south with 5,000 men to Savannah and to Charleston. He left in command as he went back to Boston a man named Lord Charles Cornwallis, a man whom he thoroughly despised, in charge of the Southern campaign. And guess what? It really started to work for the British. They routed the American forces at Camden. They had captured the big ports. And Cornwallis moved north into what was called Charlottetown in North Carolina. He had a group of dragoons, which of course are basically cavalry, led by a man named Banastre Tarleton. Everybody watched the Patriot film, that's who we're talking about. And on his right flank, he put the best shot in the British Army, one of the great officers of the British Army, a man named Patrick Ferguson. Yes, there were pockets of resistance. Andrew Pickens, Mr. Marion, my goodness, aren't we in that place now? The British were, for the most part, seemed to be winning. And after Musgrove's Mill, Ferguson sent a message of a captured prisoner up into this area. And there is Major Patrick Ferguson. He invented the breech-loading rifle. I am not a gun person, but you guys that are know that a breech-loading rifle is loaded from near the stock of the gun, as opposed to shoving a bullet down the barrel with a ramrod and powder and the other things. It wasn't used much in the Revolutionary War, but this was really a major guy. And history records that this message went something like this, according to Isaac Shelby. Desist from your opposition to the British arms, take protection under his standard, or we will come up there and we will hang your leaders and lay waste to your country with fire and sword. Well, they had routed two brothers named McDowell up into this area and up into what is now present-day Tennessee. And the McDowells basically heard this message along with Sevier and Shelby, and they basically, what did they do? They organized all the militias, and they came down, meeting at the plantation at Quaker Meadows in Morganton, a place you can visit now. 1,400 men that were fed that night in that place, which is where the golf course is now, and they went across Greenlee Ford looking for Patrick Ferguson. And you know the rest of the story. about that battle. But we have to ask, before we get to the final chapter, what caused these people to have such a ferocious response, to leave their wives and children, possibly exposed to Indian forces which were active in the area, to come down and to confront this British officer and his Tories? Was it the present troubles, or was the hatred, was the vengeance deeper than that and longer standing? And I'm going to argue it was much deeper and longer standing. So we have to ask, who were these people, these untrained militia people, which were later labeled the Over-Mountain Men? Why did they have such a ferocious response? When did the animosity towards the British begin? And I'm going to contend it was earlier than that. Who were the true origins, and how did all this play out? Now, I'm going to tell you, in that group of 1,400 men, some on horseback, some on foot, there were certainly Germans. There were certainly Swedes. There were certainly Huguenots. There were probably some African American slaves. But over 90% of the people that were in that group going down to Kings Mountain were Scots-Irish. Well, we've got to talk about the Scotch-Irish. For those that don't really know, if you thought that Scotch-Irish said, well, I've got some people that lived in Scotland that were my ancestors and some that live in Ireland, so I'm Scots-Irish, you would not be correct. This has a very specific connotation. And we've now got to think about a man or a woman who was born in 1450 and died in 1520. We think that we live in tumultuous times today, and we do. But those 70 years were especially tumultuous. Three things happened during those 70 years, during a normal lifespan of a person that would have lived during that time, that completely changed Western civilization forever. And I'll give you a hint. One was an invention, one was a discovery, and one was a revolt against an entrenched power. Now you get to speak up. What's the invention? The printing press. Good job. There it is. The Gutenberg printing press changed everything. Everything. Monks in the Middle Ages were writing out Bibles, and it took them years. People would have to send one copy and have to hear a town crier. Now you could make multiple copies. You could make, and of course the first book that was printed was the Bible. Yes, the Gutenberg Bible. And people started, as a result, to learn how to read. And they started to read, and they started to say, the Holy Fathers in the Catholic Church are telling us this, but that's not what I see here, some of them. And a bunch of other things about what kings were saying. And so there was a general raising up of education levels and awareness. All right, good job. I think everybody knows that was just a sentinel event. A discovery. What? Yes. This guy. The discovery in 1492, and were other Europeans such as the Vikings here before then? Of course they were. But this, the difference here was because of the printing press and the general rising of knowledge, people very quickly figured out that isn't India. That's a brand new continent. And that's a big deal. Yes. And what's the third thing? A revolt against an entrenched power. Yes. It's called the Reformation. Oh, y'all are on to it. I got high IQ here in McDowell County. Now, if you think that everything was hunky-dory with the Catholic Church, and one October morning he wakes up and says, you know what? I've got some problems. I'm going to nail these objections to the Catholic Church on the door of Wittenberg in Germany, you would be sadly mistaken. There have been hundreds of years where people were gradually raising objections to the way the Catholic Church was doing a lot of different things. Your brethren down in Valdez, called the Waldensians, have been raising objections since 1184. Just remember that. We were talking about the Moravians and John Hus. He predated Luther. A bunch of people predated Luther, but we'll give Luther the credit in 1517 and October 31st, nailing that. And as a result, and the Bible, and the fact there was a new world. Now, there was something else going on, was the rise of the nation states, the great powers in Europe, of which there were about 5, and armed with this revolt internally. Some were Protestant, some were Catholic, armed with the fact there was a new world, armed with the fact that people were finding out about it. The kings of all these countries said, you know what? We better get over there before the enemy does, or they're going to take all the riches. Well, what was the great power at first? It was Spain. So Spain was first out the door. And of course, they quickly subdued the French that were there at St. Augustine and St. Helena. And they, particular to current Burke County history, which is very important if you don't already know, at St. Helena, the leader sent a man named Juan Pardo, captain, into the interior of North Carolina to try to find the trade routes for the silver mines at Zacatecas, Mexico. He was very certain that just over these mountains was Mexico. He was a little wrong about that, wasn't he? And they made it as far as what is now a cornfield in Burke County, and they settled in and built a fort and a village, and they lived there for 18 months. And so your neighbor to the east, Burke County, claims they had the first European settlement to the interior of the continent of North America. And it is a true statement. And it's really cool to be out there. But that didn't last very long. The Indians overpowered them. I won't go into that because that's not the subject of our story. But the bottom line, I think, for all of us here tonight is that all these powers realized we've got to get over there and get the riches and make sure we fortify this territory before they do. Okay, so the English were last out, but we know that history changes. And in the early to mid decades of the 1500s, a man arose in England that only comes along every few hundred years. He was so powerful, he was so influential that he completely changed the course of Western history. And whom am I talking about? Henry VIII, yes. Such a consequential personality arrives on the world stage only once every few hundred years. And there he is. For you ladies, if you had to have a contest on who, remember the term male chauvinist pig, if you had to put a contest up, he would be in the running, would he not, with his 6 wives. And you could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about Henry VIII, but for our purposes, what's the point with the Scots-Irish? Well, he needed to consolidate his power, and he needed an heir to the throne. Well, he wasn't getting one with Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who financed Columbus's trip. It was all kind of a tight family, and he said Pope, and he was a rock solid Catholic. I mean, the Catholic Church recognized him as a real champion, but he wanted an annulment, and the Pope wouldn't give it to him, Pope Clement VII. So basically, you know the story. He basically said, okay, I'm now the head of the church in England, and I'm going to give myself a divorce. And he did. And then he, went through a whole bunch of other wives. And so, whereas Germany, for religious reasons, was joining the Protestant Reformation and other places in Europe, England kind of backed in politically, but they were definitely Protestant. And so they became the enemies of Catholic France and Catholic Spain, and now he had that to worry about. We've got to put ourselves back in that era. We can't imagine, why would people fight wars over religion like this? Well, they did back then. It was a big deal. So he was all tied up with the Reformation, and he took over Catholic Ireland, fearing that, because it was easy to do, and he was afraid that France or Spain would get up into there. He took the lands of the Irish earls, and he gave them back in exchange for loyalty, and to assure this, he established some plantations of English Protestants. He was just too preoccupied with all of his wives and all of his getting an heir and all the stuff that was going on domestically to worry too much about America. And of course, something happened to him that happens eventually to all of us. He didn't really establish a male heir, or not a strong one. Edward VI lived a few years, and the other problem he had is that he died. And Edward VI came into power, but was very weak. And then there was a whole era of very terrible internal conflict of who was going to rule England. But never fear, a new leader showed up about 10 years later, even stronger than Henry. And what was very unique about this leader was this person wasn't even a man. It was this person, yes. It's Queen Elizabeth, who ruled for something like 50 years. And she, of course, was the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. And she ruled till 1603. And she increased the size of the army and navy. She crushed the Spanish Armada. So now they had a breachhead. The Spanish were in disarray to establish a colony in America. And they sent Sir Walter Raleigh to the shores of our lovely state. And we claim to have the first English colony. Didn't last, did it? And as far as Ireland goes, she continued to repress with the plantations and things of this nature. So there was a period of great cultural stability and, great advances. Remember, they had a certain playwright that showed up about that time named Shakespeare. So in 1603, she died, and this guy took over. This guy is James I. James I was a fervent Protestant. He was also a Scot, and he knew the Scots. He knew the culture, and he sort of looked over at Ireland, at Catholic Ireland, and he said, the problem with Catholic Ireland is that it's full of Catholics. And we're going to do something about this. He ran off the last of the O'Neills and the Earls in the northern part of the country, and he went to his fellow Scots, all of which were loyal, and said, you know what? If you go over there and battle the Catholics for me, and we'll give you all this land, which you don't have now, and you'll be very enriched. And they took him up on the offer. So these lowland Scots, loyal to King James, fervent Protestants, went across the sea over to Ireland and established a colony called the Ulster Plantation in Northern Ireland. Well, I can see that there are some people of age in this group. Does anybody remember waking up in the morning and hearing the news about a bombing in Belfast and all this and that, the Troubles? Who remembers all that? Well, it's still going on today. So he runs off the Earls. And what better group to have over there than his own people? And this ill will is still being felt today, 400 years later, in the 6 northern counties. Now, you see Londonderry, that's where some of the bombings were. This is all 2/3 of Northern Ireland is Protestant, 1/3 Catholic. My son-in-law comes from County Tyrone in Cookstown, right in the middle, and the person for which this county is named, Joseph McDowell, and his relatives basically all came from the southern end, the northern end of Down and the southern end of Antrim County in Belfast. Okay, so that's where your folks came from. These were Protestants. They moved over. They took over the land. And how did they do? Well, they did very well because they were very industrious people. They were expert sheep and cattle farmers, and they were weavers. Joseph McDowell was a weaver himself. And they successfully battled the Catholics. They were very good at fighting. But the British had two problems. Remember, the British separated, but they basically kept the Catholic form of government in the Anglican Church. Archbishop of Canterbury was just kind of a political move. And it's a very top-down form of church government. And the British now had two problems. Problem number one is the merchants from Northern Ireland, these Scots-Irish, were too successful, and they were competing with Britain's own merchants and beating them at their own game about exporting wool and linen and certainly the meat and all that. And there was one other problem. None of these Scots-Irish were Anglican. They were something called Presbyterian, and that was very, very different. And they took their religion very seriously. So, what did the British do in Parliament? Said, well, we've got to do something about this. And by that time, Queen Anne was on the throne, James having died. And of course, earlier King William took over. And they all imposed different problems, and I'm listing them there. Trade embargoes, telling them that they couldn't import their sheep to England. We're going to tax you. Later, they even had acts prohibiting a marriage done by a Presbyterian minister. They declared it an invalid marriage. And when the leases ran out, remember they were leasing the land from the king, they raised the rent. They called it rack renting. And so I want you to get that as a background. When you're sitting on your knee as a child, your father's telling you stories about the family. Believe me, this is what was being told to the children of the Scots-Irish about how badly they were being treated by the British. And they were. Well, where did these Presbyterians get their religion from? Well, mainly from this guy who came over to Scotland having studied under this guy whose name is John Calvin. John Calvin was a Frenchman who opposed the Catholic Church, wrote voluminous volumes of material, was very smart, got run out of France and wound up in Geneva, and Knox was one of his main pupils. And people like to talk about Presbyterians and predestination, right? They talk about predestination. Predestination occupies about 50 pages of Calvin's Sentinel work, which is over 1,500 pages. Much of that has to do with church government and how a church should be run and what's the proper place of the clergy versus the laity. And it was very different than the way they did it in the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. So the church government was shared. Pastors and elders had equal power. Anybody here Presbyterian? One. See if I'm right. You can yell at me and say you're full of it. You don't know what you're talking about. The congregation, not the bishop, chooses their pastor. There is oversight by a governing body called the presbytery. That's where you get that from, and presbytery means elder. There's further oversight by higher bodies. Therefore, there is a system of checks and balances in this church government. And Calvin also emphasized the sinfulness of man. Oh, of course, other Christian religions do too. That's pretty fundamental. But he did it in spades, and he said you have to have oversight with government because men are corrupt, and if you give them too much power, they're really going to be corrupt. And an educated ministry is a must because the Bible and not the Pope is the key to our religion. Sort of, okay? All right. Well, so the Ulster Scots were dealing with the text. The text acts were basically to say, you have to be loyal to the Anglican Church. Well, what do you think the Ulster Scots did? I'm not going to be loyal to them. Well, good. You can't go to the university and you will not get any kind of government job. There were embargoes. I talked about the religious prohibitions. There were famines in 1740. This is not the big famine. The big famine was in the 1840s, and the folks that came over in the 1840s were mainly Catholic. That was the Great Famine, and that's when the Protestants started to call themselves Scots-Irish to distinguish them from the folks that came later. And of course, disease struck the cattle. So if that was happening to you, and you were in Ireland, and you knew you were literate because you learned to read, and you knew about America, and you were there, what would you do? Would you stay or would you leave? You would leave. Of course you would. And that's what they did. Ireland lost 40% of their population between 1700 and 1850. And 1/3 of the Protestants left Ulster. 250,000 people, that's a lot of people. Well, where did they go? Well, they first went to New England. And the Puritans really found these folks to be pretty objectionable. They were a little wild. They liked to dance. They liked to have a good time. And they liked their alcohol. And the Puritans, Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister, said they were the most God-provoked Democrats on this side of hell. We don't want them here. And so now, remember, this group, they weren't stationary. What did they do in the result of King James? They left Ireland to come to Scotland. Now they've left Scotland to come to America. And now they're not welcome in New England. So there are not very many Scots-Irish left in New England. So where are we going to go? Well, there was a friendlier place, and it was called Pennsylvania. Why was it friendly? Because William Penn was religiously tolerant. He was a Quaker, and he gave them land. But William Penn was a pretty smart guy, and he gave them land in the western part of his colony, and that just happened to be where all the Indians were. Remember, Quakers don't take up arms, right? But we can get somebody else to do our dirty work for us. And these people know how to shoot guns. And so that was the deal. We'll give you all this land. You protect us from the Indians. And they knew they were fierce fighters. And when the French and Indian War broke out in about 1754, they were some of the main troops that fought on the side of the British. Well, Penn raised their rent, and they were used to moving. So rent's too high, there's land available, and they moved where? They moved here. And how did they get there? By this great wagon road, which is still parts of it, we know where it is. And some 200,000 people came down through Virginia, staying in Virginia. Some moved into North Carolina. You can see the Presbyterian enclave of Charlotte is right there on the border of North and South Carolina. You can see a little trek going off to the west, and some of those people drifted down into your present-day McDowell County. And so that's why you have a western North Carolina full of Scots-Irish. So there were two great advantages. There's plenty of land, and we can pretty much be left alone to practice our religion. The Anglicans and the landed gentry of the Tidewater thought this was a pretty decent arrangement. We got rid of those pesky Presbyterians, and they'll also fight the Indians for us. So it was a natural buffering force. But something was happening in America that I get emotional about. All the people that moved here, they had a feeling that they still were bound to the mother country. The Germans that moved here, and there were many of them, they still considered themselves to be Germans. Certainly the British felt they were loyal citizens of the British Crown. But think about the Scots-Irish. They weren't Scottish. They had left there 150 years ago. They certainly weren't welcome in Ireland, and they didn't feel Irish. And they certainly didn't feel British after the way the British had treated them. So they may have been the first people to say, I'm an American. And they were loyal to clan over government. They believed in government. Everybody thinks they're anti-government. No, they weren't. But they were always suspicious of authority. They weren't afraid to borrow ideas from others. They went over and they saw these Swedes building these cabins and said, you know, they're better at it than we are. And they're the ones that took the log cabin over the mountains. It wasn't the Swedes, it was the Scots-Irish. But they didn't invent the log cabin, the Swedes did. And they were willing to fight. They knew the Indian style of fighting, and they all had rifles, and they knew how to use them. And they believed in freedom of religion, speech, and they believed they needed a college. Remember, one of their tenets was, we have to have an educated ministry. I've always asked, why are there so few Presbyterians, Tennessee and West? And there aren't as many. The reason is they insisted that the ministers had to be educated, and there simply weren't enough of them when they made that great migration. So they drifted to other denominations such as the Baptist and the Methodist. But they did, in the colonial times, build a college. It was in a little place up in New Jersey, and it was called the Log College. And then it was later changed to the name of the town. Happened to be called Princeton, okay? And they called, as you might suspect, it was being, remember, colleges back then were mainly to educate the clergy. Law, medicine, the other professions came along later to university. And they recruited this guy. His name was John Witherspoon, a Scots-Irish Presbyterian minister. He was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. And he taught Presbyterian ways, Presbyterian form of church government. Clearly he did, along with the Presbyterian religion and science and other things. They taught everything back then. Who was his most famous pupil? You get an extra credit if you know this. And it is quite significant for the founding of our country and our Constitution. Who's the father of the Constitution?
Jefferson.
Who?
Jefferson.
Not Jefferson. That guy. That was his most famous pupil. Now, I can't find anything that says, you know what? After the war was over, we're going to sit and form a government. We had a Continental Congress for that very purpose in the late 1780s. And we're going to adopt the Presbyterian Church as form of government. There is nothing written down by Madison, but you're going to tell me, based upon what you've learned about Presbyterian government and the fact that he almost literally sat on Witherspoon's knee, and he's the guy that formulated a separation of powers from the legislature and the executive and the judiciary, rising courts that can overrule the lower courts, then you have to convince me. I think that and after the war, when King George saw the Constitution, his first expression, he threw it down and said, my God, America has run off with the Presbyterians. We talked about this. No top-down rule, no king. Checks and balances, shared power. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Presbyterian form of government was put forth by Madison. The Presbyterian form of government was not adopted from the national form of government. The national form of government was adopted from the Presbyterian form of government. So, huffing and puffing, that's your background. We get to 1776 and the Ulster Scots. Guess what? When the war broke out, who were they in favor of? They were on the Patriot side. And in the North, they formed great bulk of the troops. Washington said, if defeated everywhere else, I would like to make my last stand with the Scots-Irish. The English parliamentarian Walpole said, there's no use in crying about it. Cousin America has run off with the Presbyterian parson. And the Hessian soldier said, you can call this war whatever. Of course, they were the conscripted, paid soldiers of the British. You call this what you will, but this is a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian war. And so did King George refer to it as the Presbyterian War. Now, what about the South? Well, the Southern Scots were also in favor of the Patriots. But remember, they were far removed from the fight. They were worried about a closer foe, which was the Indians. And they long held suspicions of power, and the landed gentry of the East, even people like Washington and Madison, they held in a little bit of suspicion. Remember, these were kind of rough people. And so most of them stayed home, but they did have very active militias, and they had Kentucky long rifles, and they knew how to use them. Let's go full circle. Lord North said, before he offered his resignation, the best we can make of this war, which is we're not winning, is to get out of it. And he offered the resignation, and along with Lord Germain, Secretary of Colonial Affairs, developed the Southern strategy that we talked about. They take Savannah and Charleston, they move into North Carolina, and that threat is issued. And now, as Paul Harvey used to say, for the rest of the story. I'm dating myself. Militia units from present-day Tennessee, Sevier and Shelby, Virginia, Campbell, Burke County, Charles and Joseph McDowell, Wilkes, Benjamin Cleveland, and Surrey, Winston are all alerted. These names now populate the towns of our great state. And they converged at the base of the Appalachian Range at Quaker Meadows on September the 30th, 1780. 1,400 patriots. Madam McDowell said, tear down the top railing of the fence, build fires, bring the cattle that we've hidden from the Tories from the meadows, and they slaughtered cattle and gave these men their last good meal before the fight. And they began looking for Patrick Ferguson. Now, of the 7 militia leaders, 4 were clearly Scots-Irish. Sevier was Huguenot, Shelby was Welsh, and Winston was British. The other 4 were Scots-Irish. There was a battle, pre-battle sermon on Jericho preached by the Presbyterian minister Samuel Doak, right on that property. Other militia leaders were Williams, Lacey, Hambrick, and they joined as they neared the mountain. Luck was on their side. It had rained the night before. Leaves had already fallen, but the British couldn't hear the crunch of the leaves as they approached this small hill, which they called King's Mountain. You know the story. 2 Tory defectors from the camp of the militia went south and informed Ferguson of this, and he got scared because he said, this is a lot of people. And he said, we're going to need to take our forces towards Charlottetown and join up with Cornwallis. And he realized he wasn't going to make it. And so he saw this hill and said, God himself is not going to ever take me off this hill. And he was right about that, wasn't he? The Battle of Kings Mountain, in just over 1 hour, and I am no more military historian, but this has to be one of the most decisive battles in all of human history. The Tories suffered 244 killed, 163 wounded, and basically all the rest were captured. The Patriots suffered 28 casualties. How many British-born British soldiers were in this battle? 1. Patrick Ferguson, good job. Y'all know your stuff, man. I'm going to go back and tell Robert Patton how much you know. And it was one of the most complete victories of one force over another in military history. When Cornwallis found out about it, he panicked and he left Charlotte. And on his way out of town, the Scots-Irish down there, including my seventh great-grandfather, John Kirkpatrick, took pot shots at the British forces as they were leaving, prompting Cornwallis to say, this is a blank of rebellion, a hornet's nest of rebellion in Charlotte. Cornwallis has to be the only British general to name an NBA team. That's pretty cool. Huh? The war didn't end on this day. There was another year to go. But it is my contention that the British were always on the defensive. And I'm going to contend, and historians will debate, what was the turning point? Was it Saratoga? Was it something else? But I'm going to say for us here that for me, that on that mountain, on that day, and in that very hour, colonial America, ruled by a king across an ocean 3,000 miles away, began to crumble, die, and fade away. And in its place, our forefathers did indeed raise up a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition, yet to be realized, that all are created equal. The Scots-Irish did not single-handedly win the war for America. But I think it is evident, hopefully to all here tonight, that without the Scotch-Irish, American independence never would have been won. Thank you for your attention. As a postscript, whatever happened to the Scots-Irish? Who raised their hand at the first of the lecture?
We're still here.
They weave themselves in to the American culture. And they had, something like 13 presidents have Scots-Irish background. As politically diverse as Andrew Jackson, who supported slavery, and U.S. Grant, who opposed it ferociously. And I'll make a surprise for you. Scotch-Irish heritage, Barack Obama. Remember, his father was a Kenyan African, but his mother was Scotch-Irish. So what contributions did they make? Obviously, in my opinion, government, music. Who likes country music? It's Scotch-Irish. So thank you for your attention. What questions do you have? Not a one. I've appreciated the opportunity to come talk to you tonight. I hope you learned something. I hope you were entertained. Okay.
John, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
That was wonderful. I feel privileged to have been here and heard it. I'm so glad that we have recorded it for those who were not able to get here tonight.